Hello. For my short story collection this quarter, I chose Look at the Birdie by Kurt Vonnegut. I chose it because I've always been really interested in Vonnegut, but I've never read any of his work. And yes, that does include Slaughterhouse-Five. It's been on my to read list for a very long time, but for some reason I haven't got around to it. So I thought maybe starting with some of his short stories, I can get an idea of his writing and who he is, and hopefully you move on to some of his longer works like Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle and things of that nature. And I'm glad I did because it was a really an amazing collection. I got to learn a little bit more about Kurt Vonnegut in doing this project. Like I said, I never read his work before, so I didn't know a lot about him as a writer either. Unfortunately, he did pass away in 2007, but before that, he had a career that spanned over 50 years. He published 14 novels, three short story collections, five plays, and five works of nonfiction. So he's definitely a well-rounded and, very important author to the American opus, I would say. He's recently passed, but I think that he's going to go down in history as one of our great authors. So I can't wait to read more of his work. He, of course, was made famous or, got a lot more readership when he published Slaughterhouse-Five because everybody was really interested in the anti-war sentiment that he exhibited in that story. And he did actually serve in World War II. He was captured at the Battle of the Bulge, which I thought was really interesting. I bet he has a lot of stories about that. I'm not sure he wrote about them, but it definitely probably gave him, a good sense of humanity, which is what he writes about a lot. Like the human being as, all of the good and the bad and the emotions and things of that nature, the dark and the light. He does a lot more dark and satirical. But, I'm really interested to read more of his work, and I'm really glad that I read Look at the Birdie and got to get a sample of his writing. That was so good. What is interesting about Look at the Birdie is that it was published posthumously. I guess he had submitted these stories, I don't know, maybe not as a collection, but individually to different editors that he'd worked with over the years at a lot of different publications, and they rejected these stories, which I think is really interesting. If this is, the worst of his work, then his other stuff must be really great. But of course, he's also a perfectionist, as a lot of us writers are, was always revising, and maybe he felt some of these weren't ready to be published and things of that nature. I guess, without researching each of them individually, we'll never really know. But I'm really glad that this got published and that people got to see some of his work that, we may have never seen if it didn't get put into this collection. So I'm excited to tell you guys a little bit about the collection, and hopefully you'll check it out. I know I'm probably the only person in the class that hasn't read other Vonnegut, but if you haven't read this, since it's pretty new, hopefully you will be able to read it now. And let's look at some of the stuff that was in the collection. I liked this quote from Vonnegut that says, "I want to stand as close to the edge as I can without going over. Out on the edge, you see all the kinds of things you can't see from the center." And I think that his stories and Look at the Birdie, embody that sort of sentiment. They are not connected by character or setting or anything of that nature, but there is a general theme of humanity in them, and the good and the bad and the interesting, things that make you think about your life and about other aspects of, being in a world where not everything is good, and bad people versus good people and things of that nature. So I think that that is what this collection embodies when it comes to the theme of the overall piece. Now, with it being some work that he hadn't published before, I'm not sure that they meant to have a theme for it, and that might just be Vonnegut's writing and what he just does, naturally as a writer. But that was the only thing that connected these stories together for me, was an underlying aspect of showing who people really are, their innermost thoughts, the darkness, and that sort of thing. So it's definitely easy to see that he was able to see into the core of people as he stood on the edge instead of being at the center. So Look at the Birdie included 14 stories. They are Confido, Fubar, Shout About It from the Housetops, Ed Luby's Key Club, A Song for Selma, Hall of Mirrors, The Nice Little People, Hello Red, Little Drops of Water, The Petrified Ants, The Honor of the Newsboys, Look at the Birdie, of course, King and Queen of the Universe, and The Good Explainer. And I would like to tell you a little bit about a few, let's say, that were interesting and really good reads, and I hope you guys check them out. Confido is the first story in this collection, and I have to say that I think that it's well beyond its time for when he allegedly wrote it. It talks about, well, I should say, it speaks to the dependence that we have on um, technology and social media and things of that nature nowadays. But basically, what it's about is a guy who works for a company that makes some earpieces or some things like that. And he ends up coming up with his own idea of this thing called Confido, which is basically like a Bluetooth almost that you can put in your ear, and it talks to you like it's your friend. It somehow gets your inner thoughts, and it's basically like constant communication in your head. But unfortunately, it has the negative side effect of telling you your worst fears, your worst insecurities, all of those sort of things. So it ends up being more of a curse than a blessing. And the family, at first the dad still wants to make money off of it, but once he realizes what it's doing to his wife and his family, they end up burying it in the backyard. And he goes on to being kind of the lackey that he's been his whole life, and not making the money off of it because of the detrimental effects that it has on people. So it's a really interesting story, and it's the first one in the collection. So when I read that, I was like, okay, so this guy is part sci-fi, part dystopia, part human nature, and I really got me excited for the rest of the collection. So it was a good start. Fubar was another really interesting story in this collection. I did like a lot of the stories at the beginning of the collection. You know, each one is so poignant when it comes to the message that Vonnegut is trying to portray. Fubar is about a man, everybody knows him. He's that shy, awkward, antisocial guy. He reminds me of Milton from Office Space, if you guys have ever seen that movie. And this particular character, it keeps getting moved, kind of like Milton does, and eventually ends up outside in a different building from the rest of his colleagues for his job. And they send him a secretary who seems really excited to be there. And he, thinks that she's not going to be happy there. She's far away from all of the action of the, interoffice politics. And she really opens him up and shows him about himself. Basically, their office out of the rec center and nobody ever uses it. So, he at first is like, find a different assignment, do whatever you need to do. I know you don't want to be here. And in the end, she gets him to open up and go in the recreational swimming pool with him, and he just turns into a different person. So it's another one of the examples of Vonnegut really getting at the root of humanity in somebody that's so closed off and antisocial, I guess you could say. But really, what he is insecure and has no self esteem, and she makes him, realize that he's more than what he thinks he is. So it's a really good one, and it was one of my favorites from the book. This story is about a woman who decides to write a book that is loosely but pretty much based on her town, her husband, and herself. And it backfires in a way that the whole town is against her. Her relationship with her husband is strained, and everything is kind of falling apart around her. And even though she has become famous and everybody knows the book, she feels like she wants to go back to her old life and doesn't want the notoriety and the hatred that she's getting for portraying the people that are close to her in a book. And I think that's something that we can all relate to. There's a lot of nonfiction or creative nonfiction projects on my back burner that, could cause some issues with some of my friends and family. And it's a choice that we have to make when we do that. So a um, storm window salesman comes to her house, doesn't know who she is, her husband, anything, has never read the book, and is basically sat down in the middle of this huge conflict between her and her husband and the fallout from the book. And they end up basically giving him her royalty check for her book because she's so over everything that has to do with it that she just gives it away for storm windows. And in the end, he worries that he'll find a book on the shelf someday that has to do with the storm window salesman that came to the woman's house. So it's really interesting, really something that resonates, I'm sure, with all of us. And I think that you guys would really enjoy this story. Ed Luby's Key Club is the longest short story that's in this book. And when I first saw the page number, I was a little bit daunted, not because I can't read long things, but because the rest of the stories I had read beforehand were significantly shorter. So, I kind of went into it like, ugh, this is going to suck. But it was actually a great story and one of the best in the book. Now, it deals with an issue that is explored a lot in both, fiction and television and even movies, but somehow it does it in a way that makes you feel completely different about the situation. It is about a couple who have always spent their anniversary at this certain club, which apparently Ed Luby recently turned into a key club, which is, a members only type of thing. And when the couple gets there to get in, they're kind of harassed and things of that nature. And in the parking lot, they see the proprietor of the club commit a crime. And, when they go to the authorities and they try to help the people that are affected by the crime, they realize that everybody in the town and the township and even the county possibly are in this guy's pocket. Now, like I said, everybody does this. You know, it's par for the course for so many TV shows and things of that nature. But somehow Vonnegut makes it so intense and so like surreal that you really get inside the head of the narrator who is taken advantage of by, the leader of the club and the police when he goes to them and all these people and ends up being hunted himself instead of the perpetrator of the crime. That it really just gets to you, and you get how, crooked cops and how money and influence can, rule a town. And I mean, it takes him getting out of the town to another hospital, to FBI agents pretending that they're doctors to finally get everything situated. This guy is so powerful that even the FBI is kind of afraid of him. So it's really interesting, and it's not cliche, and it's not, what everything else is in the genre. So it's probably the best story in the book and the longest, but it's well worth the read. So, Look at the Birdie is the title piece for this collection, and I don't know why whoever chose it. I would be really interested to know if Vonnegut would have chosen a different title piece from some of the other stories. Hall of Mirrors is really good, and I think that it captures kind of the whole thing. Little Drops of Water is really good, and I think that it could also speak to each one of them. So it's interesting that whoever put this collection together after Vonnegut was gone, chose Look at the Birdie. But it's actually a really good story. I don't know that it's the best story or the story that should be the flagship of the collection, but it's about a previous psychiatrist, although his qualifications are questionable, and he has turned hitman. So he is talking to the narrator about, being a hitman, shows him a briefcase full of pictures that he'll put the narrator's picture in as well. And the twist of the story is that he uses his previous paranoid schizophrenic clients to do his hits for him so he can never get caught, and it's constant money for him, and the people that use him go into the briefcase, and if they betray him in any way, then the paranoid schizophrenics will come after them. So it's a really cool short story, something in addition to Ed Luby's Key Club and some of the others, possibly one that I'm going to talk to you about in a second, King and Queen of the Universe, some things that could really become cinematic. And I know it's hard to make a short story into a movie, but this one and Ed Luby's Key Club actually could become a really interesting movie. So it's too bad that Vonnegut wasn't around to write either a play or a screenplay on these, but it's awesome that we got to read them after the fact. So it took me a while to decide which stories from this collection that I wanted to present to you guys because each and every one is interesting and speaks to kind of the core of humanity that Vonnegut has such a great talent for doing. So I thought I would end with King and Queen of the Universe. It's the second to last story in the book, and it's basically about these socialite kids, teenagers probably, who come from great families. Pretty much their families are forcing them together because they're two of the most powerful families in the city, and they want them to get married, and it's just, a good match, which is an old fashion point of view, but something that still happens today. And of course, these kids want to rebel because that's what kids do. Excuse me. And they decide after a social function that they're going to sneak off together, and they take a walk through kind of a seedy part of town through a park, and they meet this guy who at first they think is a beggar. And then he tells them a story about how he's a great scientist and, has this great experiment that he came up with that's going to change the face of science or whatever on that front, and ask them to come back to his house to look at it. And at first you're thinking this is really nefarious, like he's going to kidnap them or murder them or something of that nature. But actually, what he's doing is pretty sad and heart wrenching, sort of. So when they get to his place, they see in the corner a bed, and they don't think anybody's in it. And then they realize as he goes over there that his dying mother is in the bed, and he shows them his experiment, which isn't really anything, but does have them talk to his mother and tell her, that he's done it and he's a great scientist and all that sort of thing, because what he wants is for her to die thinking that her son has made something of himself. So it's really sad, but of course their parents, who aren't going to let their kids wander off like that, send the cops after them, who end up in his apartment and take the guy away. His mother dies seeing the cops taking her son away instead of the great, message he wanted to send about, him being able to make it. So it's really sad. They do end up making it good in the end because both of the kids are really upset with their parents, but it's a pretty hard story to read. But again, it speaks to the core of humanity and of what's important to people, and how people are treated, and that's a lot of what this whole collection has to do with. And it was really good, like I keep telling you guys. So definitely try to check it out. Thanks. So there were a lot of elements that we studied over the course when it came to short stories: openings, plot, characterization, point of view, pace, structure, humor, and endings. And when I was reading Vonnegut, it was a lot like reading some of the really good short stories or novellas that I've read recently, where I kind of got lost in the stories instead of really paying attention as a writer to how Vonnegut did it. And I think that's just a testament to what a great writer he is. I think that all of the things that we have gone through apply to Vonnegut's work, but I think that maybe the most important is characterization. His openings are poignant, his plots follow through correctly with good endings, his POVs switch up, but they always suit the story. The structures and the pace are relevant to the work that he's doing. He has a lot of humor, even if it is dark or satirical humor. And his endings are actually really good because, endings are one of the hardest things to do, and Vonnegut seems to have a good handle on that. But I think that he mostly shines with his characterization because the point of Vonnegut's stories, in this collection at least, even though it was never published, which, makes me wonder if he would have liked these stories put together as a cohesive whole, or if he would have done something different, or if he would have put them in a different order, or if he would have had plans, for how they came across in a certain way. But as I've mentioned a lot, the human spirit and, just what goes on in humanity, whether it's dark, which many of them are, even though every one but one ends on a good note. That's what Vonnegut does in his stories, or at least from what I've read here. And his characterization is what makes us interested in what goes on. In all of the ones that I've mentioned, the vulnerability and the importance of doing the right thing is what drives most of his stories. Confido ends with him burying it. Fubar ends with him, being happy. Shouted at the Rooftops ends with the author, realizing that she would rather have her townsfolk and her family than her fame. Um, look at the Birdie ends crazy. But, the king and queen of the universe and the good explainer, they all end in a way that seems happy and really shows, what it takes to make a short story work. They've got great openings and great endings, and in between the plot, the characterization, the point of view, pace, structure, a little bit of humor mixed in, he has all of those on lock. So I'm really glad that I read this particular work. I think it's going to be a big influence on me, and I hope to read more of Vonnegut. And I just really gleaned a lot from what I learned from him in terms of characterization, mostly, but everything else that went into his work. So I hope you enjoyed my short story project. I definitely enjoyed doing it, as well as reading all the great short stories that Vonnegut never got to publish in his lifetime. So go out and read it. I know I've ruined a lot of it for you, but it's still worth a read and a really good study in how to make a short story work. Thank you.